Our text this morning is verse 7 of that first chapter of Nahum. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that trust in him. The prophecy of Nahum focuses upon the judgment that God would bring against Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and indeed against the Assyrian Empire itself. The dating of Nahum's prophecy cannot be determined with absolute precision, though it's apparent from the context of the book that Nahum prophesied after the 10 northern tribes of Israel had been taken into captivity by the Assyrians, that occurring in the year 721 BC. And so that's one side, as it were, of the prophecy, or one dating of the prophecy of Nahum, and the other is the destruction of Nineveh by the Babylonians, which is also referred to in this prophecy, which occurred in the year 612 BC. Nahum's prophetic utterances suggest that he was a resident of Judah and that he prophesied during the reign of Manasseh, king of Judah. The purpose of Nahum's prophecy was threefold. Firstly, to warn sinners of God's exacting justice. Secondly, to assure God's people of his power to save. And thirdly, to vouchsafe God's redemptive purpose by showing that no opposition, not even the great world powers, could frustrate the advancement of God's kingdom. Nahum was acutely aware that the Lord was the incomparable and all-powerful God who exercised universal dominion over the kingdoms of this world. And Nahum also was well aware that God exercised that power even with respect to the Assyrians, who at that time were the great world power. Now, the Assyrians, of course, were those who had dealt mercilessly with the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and they'd also been those who in the ensuing years had severely persecuted the children of Judah. The Nahum's prophecy should be directed against Nineveh and against Assyria itself is actually interesting in the light of the prophecy of Jonah. You might recall that some 150 years prior to this prophecy of Nahum, Jonah had prophesied to the 10 northern tribes of Israel concerning the destruction of Nineveh. You might remember that in Jonah chapter 3 we hear those words, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown." But if you're familiar with the book of Jonah, you also know that to the dismay of Jonah, Nineveh had repented under the ministry of Jonah, and as a result, the Lord had spared Nineveh. But Nineveh's reprieve was only temporary. Over the ensuing 150 years, Nineveh reverted to her former ways and to her savagery and brutality, so much so that in the days of Nahum, Nineveh's cup of iniquity was full to overflowing. Nahum opens his prophecy with a description of the Lord's righteous indignation against sin and wickedness. He declares the Lord to be jealous, a jealous God, a God who burns with zeal for the maintenance of his holiness. And he declares that the Lord is in fact furious with the wicked. He will not acquit them because of their outrageous sins, but rather he will pour out his vials of wrath upon them. And he will do so with fearful severity. And so we find that Nahum, in a sense, reflects something of that pouring out of the wrath of God when he describes God as coming in a whirlwind and descending in a storm, where he issues rebukes through the hotness of his anger, such that the sea itself is dried up. The fierceness of God's wrath, Nahum indicates to us, is such as he rhetorically asks, who can stand before his indignation, and who can abide in the fierceness of his anger? In the midst of those prophetic utterances of the wrath of God and of destruction, we find perhaps to our surprise the words of our text. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that trust in him. Those words stand as a beacon of encouragement to Judah in the midst of the dark clouds of judgment that Nahum was pronouncing against Assyria. And the significance of our text should not be underestimated. It was spoken to the church in Nahum's day, and through the prophecy of Nahum, it's spoken to us as a church today. The days in which Nahum prophesied were dark and difficult days for the children of Judah. They were, as our text makes reference, they were days of trouble. Days of trouble with respect to the Ninevites, and they were days of trouble certainly for the children of Judah as well. In the midst of those days of trouble, Nahum reveals the goodness of the Lord. And he reveals that he's a stronghold, he's a refuge, he's a place of security and safety for his people. And so that's what I want to look at this morning as we consider this text out of Nahum chapter 1. Our refuge in a day of trouble is what I've entitled this sermon. Divided under these three headings: a threatening enemy, secondly a strong refuge, and then finally a certain confidence. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. The expression day of trouble refers to a time of distress occasioned by opposition, by oppression, by trial, by persecution. A day such that a man or a woman is unable really any longer to determine the course of their life or to govern their own affairs by virtue of those things. Such a day of trouble had come upon the children of Judah. And as a result, the children of Judah were overwhelmed with anxiety and fear. Nothing was certain, everything was in a state of flux. Judah's day of trouble was primarily attributable to the Assyrians who dwelt to their north. Assyria, as I've already mentioned, at this time was the dominant world power, and it occupied that position by virtue of its considerable military might. And this was a position that Assyria had occupied now, or by the time that Nahum prophesied, they'd occupied that position for well over a century. And the force of the Assyrians was a present threat, an ever-present threat, in fact, to the existence of Judah. The Assyrian military juggernaut had swept all before it. It had overrun all of the nations that surrounded and bordered Judah. None of those nations, not even the 10 tribes of Israel, had been able to resist the military might of the Assyrians. The Assyrians were a formidable enemy, and they persecuted their warfare with shocking ferocity. The 10 northern tribes of Israel had experienced that ferocity. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, had come against Samaria, the capital of the 10 northern tribes, in the year 724 BC. The 10 northern tribes had been no match for the might of Assyria. And for over 3 years, Samaria had been besieged by the Assyrians until it eventually succumbed and was destroyed. And as a result, the 10 northern tribes of Israel were no more. The population of those 10 northern tribes have been scattered throughout the Assyrian Empire. And now Judah was in danger of being similarly swallowed up by Assyria. Indeed, for over 50 years, Assyria had threatened to do just that to Judah. Only 8 years after Shalmaneser had destroyed Samaria, his successor, Sennacherib, had mounted an offensive against the cities of Judah. You might be familiar with that because that's recorded in not only the book of Kings but also in the book of Isaiah. It occurred during the reign of Hezekiah. And initially, in the days of Hezekiah, Assyria had exacted a tribute from Judah. But when Hezekiah rebelled against the might of Assyria, the weight of the Assyrian Empire was brought to bear upon Judah. Jerusalem was besieged. Assyria would have overcome Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah, if not for the miraculous intervention of the Lord. I'd recall that in Isaiah 37, you read this, "Then the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh." Though Sennacherib was forced to retreat, nonetheless, throughout the reign of Hezekiah and into the reign of his son Manasseh, Judah lived under the constant threat of attack from the Assyrians. And like the 10 northern tribes, Judah was no match for the military might of Assyria. The truth was that Judah was at the mercy of the Assyrians, and the threat of the Assyrian army led to ongoing uncertainty and fear within Judah. The measure of uncertainty and fear among the inhabitants of Judah was heightened when Assyria in the days of Esarhaddon began to flex her military muscles again in an attempt to recover the tributary provinces west of the Euphrates that had been lost during the reign of Sennacherib. As a part of that campaign, so there's all these series of campaigns that the Assyrians have mounted against their surrounding neighbours and particularly also against Judah. And as part of that campaign, we read in 2 Chronicles 33 that the Assyrians captured Manasseh, that is the king of Judah, and imprisoned him in Babylon in order to bring Judah back under the Assyrian yoke. In 2 Chronicles 33, verse 11, we read that the Assyrians bound Manasseh with fetters and carried him to Babylon. Well, you can imagine the effect that that had upon the nation of Judah, their king, snatched from the very midst of the nation by the Assyrians and taken captive to Nineveh. And this event in itself demonstrated Judah's inability to maintain even control over her own borders. What became increasingly evident to many in Judah was that Judah's continuance as a nation was dependent upon the whims of the kings of Assyria. And so it's not difficult to appreciate something of the fear and anxiety that was occasioned by the presence of the Assyrians. Judah could not defend herself. Nothing was secure, nothing was certain. These were difficult days, distressing days for Judah. And that's why Nahum refers to them as a day of trouble. But the Church of God in every age is confronted by such days of trouble. That is, periods marked by uncertainty, fear, distress, and discouragement. Periods where the Church of God is assailed, where it appears as though the church can't survive, where the ability of the church to determine its own course appears to have been effectively removed, where all seems helpless and where there seems to be no place, in fact, to turn. boxed into a corner from which there is no escape. The church apparently going down to defeat. This was the situation in Nahum's day. It's also a situation in which the church has repeatedly found herself throughout history. This is, of course, a situation that not only churches experience, but so too individual believers experience those very same things. You and I experience days of trouble in our personal lives, trouble in our material circumstances, trouble as regards our work, troubles in our families, in our marriages, in our relationships with others. And not infrequently we all encounter a vast array of situations week by week that are actually beyond us. So no matter what we do, nothing seems to change. Wherever we look, wherever we turn, no matter what we do, things appear to be out of control. So much so that there appears to be no remedy and little hope or little comfort. Now, brethren, we need to realise, and it was true in Nahum's day, but it's true also today, that Satan is frequently at work in such circumstances and situations. Indeed, Satan is always at work in the midst of the church and in the midst of the lives of God's people. We would be foolish to think that Satan is not at work in the midst of the church and in the midst of our own lives. And while it needs to be acknowledged that the days of trouble that we experience in the church and in our own lives are often facilitated by our own sins, the reality is that Satan is often behind those things, feeding the flames, orchestrating the conflicts, stirring up the strife. And Satan seizes every opportunity to occasion fear and distress and discouragement among the people of God. The truth is that when we are overcome with fear, with distress and with discouragement, we struggle to be about the work of the Lord. Now, the Christian life becomes difficult. It becomes a struggle. And the reality is we don't serve the Lord as we should. Our minds are preoccupied, and our service of the Lord becomes, in many instances, a secondary consideration. Satan sought to use Assyria to instill fear, distress and discouragement among the children of Judah. And in doing so, his goal was to thwart the coming of the Messiah through the ultimate destruction of the people of God. But Satan was not able to accomplish his purposes through Assyria. He could not thwart the coming of the Christ. Despite the might of Assyria, Assyria, in fact, would be overthrown. Nineveh, that great city, would be destroyed. In 612 BC, the combined forces of the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, the Medes and the Persians overwhelmed the Assyrians and razed Nineveh to the ground. But this ought not to surprise us. The destruction of Nineveh did not result in the cessation of Satan's attempts to destroy Judah, to destroy the Church of God in the Old Testament, and thereby to prevent the coming of Jesus Christ. You see, the Assyrians would be followed on the world stage by another equally wicked and brutal empire in the form of the Babylonians. And after the Babylonians, if you're familiar with history, after the Babylonians would arise the Medes and the Persians. And after the Medes and the Persians would come Alexander the Great and the Greeks. Alexander and the Greeks in turn would be followed by the Romans. And all those great world powers were used by Satan in an attempt to destroy the cause of Jesus Christ. And that the very same thing is happening in the world and has been happening in the world since the days of Jesus Christ himself. Satan using the great world powers as instruments in his hand in an attempt to destroy the cause of Jesus Christ. And brethren, Satan is still seeking to silence the witness of the church and to derail the cause of Christ today. The Church of God and we as believers are not immune from days of trouble. It has never been the Lord's purpose that his people should be able to ride serenely above the storms and trials of this life. For example, the Lord does not whisk his people out of the world following their coming to faith, so they might avoid altogether the trials and tribulations of this world. It might seem attractive to us, but that's not the way in which the Lord works. No, days of trouble are part and parcel of the life of the Church of God, and they are part and parcel of the life of every believer. We do well to recall what Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12, as Paul was seeking to prepare Timothy for the work of the ministry. There Paul said to Timothy, "Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." In other words, brethren, if you will seek to live godly in Christ Jesus, you will suffer persecution. That's the lot of the child of God. The Lord's usual pattern is that he only brings us to glory after we have walked a while in the midst of the trials and tribulations of this life, and after we have been tried in the crucible of affliction. Brethren, Satan is at work in the midst of the world. He is at work in the midst of the church, and he is in the midst of our church. And he continues to employ whatever means will serve his purposes. As regards the world itself, he turns nation against nation. He encourages war and turmoil. He employs terror. He invokes fear. He fosters doubt and uncertainty. He engenders paranoia in the leaders of the nations. He did that among the children of Judah, so they lived under the constant shadow and threat of Assyria. But not only does he do that with respect to nations, but Satan is at work in the life of individual believers as well. And Satan seeks to destroy our confidence and trust. That confidence and trust that we ought to have in the Lord and in his promises. And he does that in a myriad of ways. He does that, for example, by highlighting the strength of the forces arrayed against the church, coupled with the apparent weakness of the church itself. And as we look at the strength of those opposed to the cause of Christ, and as we assess the strength of the church and of her members, at times all appears forlorn, hopeless. It appears as though there is nothing that can be done, nothing can be achieved. The tendency is for us in such circumstances to become fearful, anxious, downhearted, and discouraged. It is evident that the church today is living in days of trouble. It's true also that we as believers are living in days of trouble. Not that the days in which we live are probably any more exceptional or troublesome than other periods of church history. Nonetheless, we do live in days of trouble. There seems to be trouble on every side. We see that in the world itself, trouble among the nations of the world, trouble in society. We live in a day of increasing anxiety and fear, even hopelessness for many. Increasingly, men and women despair as to how they can maintain themselves and make a place for themselves in the world. We see, for example, even presently in Australia, that interest rates are rising, prices are going up, the cost of living is increasing, and the measure of despair in the nation is on the rise. If we look around us in the affairs of the nation, we see acts of staggering wickedness and sin that matches in some measure even the depraved acts of the Assyrians. Kidnappings, murders, massacres, genocide. All of these things come right into the midst of our homes through the television and through the internet. And we are brought face to face with real people, real fathers and mothers, real sons and daughters, who are facing real trouble, real conflict, and enduring real suffering. Days of trouble. And brethren, as was the case in Nahum's day, we live in a day in which the cause of Christ is being assailed. Biblical truths are assailed and marginalised. Believers are persecuted for their opposition to many moral issues. For example, they're persecuted as regards their opposition to same-sex marriage. They're persecuted for their rejection of homosexual relationships. They're persecuted because of their stand on gender conversion practices, abortion. They're persecuted too for their desire to pursue and to uphold Christian education. And the opposition, some of which even arises from within the visible church, is determined and considerable. And such opposition is becoming increasingly militant. And as we look at the future potentially appears extremely difficult. And perhaps we, as a result, become fearful, anxious and discouraged, not only for ourselves, but we're fearful and anxious and discouraged for our children and for rising generations. Days of trouble concern not only the church in general, but in the EPC we also are experiencing days of trouble. Now, we may not all agree as to why that is so, and we might have all sorts of suggested remedies for the problems that we face. But whatever the reasons, whatever the perceived remedies may be, it is undeniable that we as a church are experiencing days of trouble. The obvious question that arises is, what are we to do? What are we to do when we experience, whether in the church or personally, days of trouble? What's the answer? Is there an answer? Or is it simply a situation where we simply have to grin and bear with those trials and tribulations and those days of trouble? In response to the troubles that confronted Judah, notice what Nahum declares in our text. He says this: "The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble." The Lord, as you'll recognise there by the capitalisation of Lord, the reference is literally to Jehovah, to the covenant-keeping God. And Nahum declares that the Lord, the covenant-keeping God, is good. And furthermore, he declares that he is a stronghold. He's a fortress in the day of trouble. When Nahum declares that the Lord is good, he is not simply informing the children of Israel, or the children of Judah more specifically, that the Lord was benevolent and kind. Nor was he simply referring to the fact that he was benevolent and kind with respect to them as his covenant people. Nor was he simply seeking to inform them that the Lord would provide for them a place of refuge and safety in the day of trouble. Now, all that was true. All that was true. The Lord was and is undoubtedly good. And he is a stronghold. He is a fortress. He is a place of refuge and safety in the day of trouble. But in declaring that the Lord is good, Nahum is also supplying to us the fundamental explanation as to why the Lord would bring his fierce wrath down upon the Assyrians. The Lord would bring down his wrath upon the Assyrians because he is good. Goodness is one of the attributes or perfections of God. All that the Lord does is good. Therefore, in the implementation of his justice and judgment, the Lord is good. When he executes judgment, when he pours out his wrath upon the wicked, the Lord is good. He is unchangeably good. He is good at all times and in every circumstances. From everlasting to everlasting, the Lord is good. He is good not in the weak and somewhat sickly way that many today perceive him to be good. He is not good in the sense that he winks at or disregards sin. Sin is no light matter to the Lord. Indeed, because he is good, he will not overlook sin. He is perfectly upright in all that he does. Therefore, he is good not only in his grace and mercy, he is certainly good in his grace and mercy, but he is also good in his wrath and judgment. Indeed, the Lord's goodness, his ethical perfection, reveals itself in his wrath and judgment. His goodness is to be found in his righteousness, in his holiness, and in his justice, and in his wrath and judgment. And it's because he is good that he cannot and will not overlook sin. If he were to do that, that would be a denial of his goodness. God's goodness demanded that Nineveh and the Assyrians be punished for their sins. Now, in revealing that to the children of Judah and exposing to them something of the awesome nature of God's impending judgment upon Nineveh, the Lord also was not unmindful of the anxiety and fear that was being experienced among his people in Judah. And that's why Nahum also declares to the children of God that not only is the Lord good, but that he would also be a stronghold for them in the day of trouble. The Lord's goodness, you see, is manifested not only in his wrath and judgment, but the Lord's goodness is also manifested in his love and care for his people. The Lord's people, we, live in the midst of a sin-filled world. Sin abounds on every side. And so consequently, as believers, we will experience days of trouble. In recognition of that reality, the Lord, through Nahum, assures Judah, and he assures us here this morning, that he is a stronghold in such days of trouble. He will be a fortress, a citadel, a place of protection and safety for his people in such days. He was that for Judah, and he is that for believers today. Brethren, there is no refuge. There is no safety to be found in men. Our refuge and safety is to be found in the Lord alone. And so when we encounter days of trouble, the answer does not lie in ourselves. It does not lie in other men. It doesn't lie in what we can accomplish or what we can do. But it's to be found in the Lord alone. We should bear in mind that even as Judah looked to the Lord in their day of trouble, that did not mean that they would not experience the difficulties and the trials associated with such a day. They did. And the same holds true for us. So the point is this: we ought not to think that by looking to the Lord that all of our trials and tribulations will simply be removed. So far as Judah was concerned, as we've already mentioned, the Assyrians may have been overcome, but then the Babylonians would then replace them. And only a few years later, in fact, the Babylonians would besiege Jerusalem and take Judah into captivity. The fact that the Lord is good and that he is a stronghold in the day of trouble does not mean that as believers we will not encounter trouble in our lives. Those days will come. Those trials and tribulations will come. But what we need to know is this: there is protection and safety to be found in the Lord. And it's to the Lord that we must look. We should understand here that the Lord is not promising Judah or indeed us physical refuge and safety. But the Lord, the covenant-keeping God, was assuring Judah that in him there was to be found spiritual refuge and safety. And that's the promise to us. In the living God there is spiritual refuge and safety. And that spiritual refuge and safety is to be found in Jesus Christ. It's to Jesus Christ ultimately, brethren, that we must look for our refuge and safety. It's in him that we will find that help and assistance in times of deepest distress. It's in him that we find comfort and encouragement when faced with seemingly insurmountable difficulties, when the issues of life seem to be beyond us. As we seek the Lord, as we put our trust in Jesus Christ, it's there that we'll find a stronghold that will guard and protect our hearts and minds in the days of trouble. In Jesus Christ, there is an answer to our fears and anxieties. So in the midst of the storms of life, the Lord, in and through the saving work of Jesus Christ, will provide a hiding place for you and me. How can we be certain? How can we be confident that that's true? How can we be confident the Lord will be our stronghold in the day of trouble? Nahum assures us of that in our text when he continues, and he's speaking there of the Lord, he knoweth them that trust in him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that trust in him. In what sense does the Lord know those that trust in him? The knowledge to which Nahum refers here is not one simply of recognition or of awareness. Nahum is not simply asserting that the Lord is aware of those who will trust and put their confidence in him. If that's all that's being asserted here, then that would not provide any source of real comfort or encouragement. The Lord simply knows those who will put their confidence in him, or that he's simply aware of us. The knowledge of the Lord, to which reference is made here, is something quite different. It's the knowledge of the Lord to which reference, for example, is made in Genesis 18 and verse 19. There the Lord said of Abraham, "For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him." When the Lord said of Abraham, "I know him," he was referring to the fact that he knew Abraham in love. God's knowledge of Abraham was the knowledge of love, everlasting love. The Lord knew Abraham, and he knew him in love because he had chosen Abraham before the foundation of the world to be his. According to his sovereign will, the Lord had chosen Abraham to be his own. And before the world began, the Lord had set his love upon him. And it was in that sense that the Lord knew Abraham. And that's why the Lord could declare with absolute confidence concerning Abraham that he would command his children in the ways of the Lord. Now here in our text, Nahum declares that the Lord knows them that trust in him. The reference here is also to a knowledge of everlasting love, a love that has its source before the world began. Before the world began, the Lord chose to save a people unto himself in and through Jesus Christ. And out of love, he ordained that they should have a place in his covenant and kingdom. That love, of course, was manifested most distinctly at the cross, where Jesus Christ laid down his life for those whom the Father had chosen and given unto him before the world began. And it was at the cross that their eternal refuge and safety was secured. Brethren, the Lord knows in love them that trust him. You see, the reposing of our trust in the Lord is actually not of ourselves. It comes about by virtue of a work of God's grace in us. God loves us, and God works in us by his Spirit. Therefore, the Lord himself is the source of our confidence. He's the source of our confidence that he will be our stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows us. He's known us from eternity, and he's known us in love. And he will fulfill his promises. He will be our stronghold in the day of trouble. Therefore, brethren, by his grace, let us look to him in the day of trouble. We can trust him. he will assuredly fulfill his promises to his people. Brethren, when we encounter days of trouble, as we inevitably will, let us not be anxious and fearful, but let us remember the words here of Nahum. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he will be that for us, both now and forevermore, because he loves us in Jesus Christ. Amen. Let's stand for